Most people would say that they believe in the existence of a world that is just beyond that which we can see with our own eyes, a spiritual world. This world surrounds us and you can sense it and you can feel it, but you can't quite see it. But what if you could? Hello and welcome again to the Faith and Fringe podcast. I'm your host, Kirk Whitmire, and this is episode 9, Through the Veil. So we just got done in last episode with wrapping up this series that I've been working through for some time now, which was to help establish a framework and a foundation for the types of things, theologically at least, that we would encounter and talk about on the show going forward. And that was a great series. I hope you guys enjoyed that. We did do the interview. That was kind of a breakup in there, but this is another type of episode in a new format that I'm really excited to get into with you guys. So I'd like to kind of take some time ever so often and discuss some books that I've really enjoyed. And one of those such books I came across last year, and it's called The Veil. And it's by an author whose name is Blake Healy. Now, I had never heard of Blake Healy, and honestly, I wish I could remember how I even came across this book. It was probably some video on YouTube, and then I realized there was a book, and I went out there and I downloaded it. And it's a pretty short audiobook listen, right around the 3.5, maybe 4 hour mark. And I flew through This was done in a day. So if you're into this episode and you want to go check this out, I highly encourage it. You obviously can get it in, the regular form to read. I just listen to a lot of audiobooks. It's easier for me when I drive and stuff like that. I really can kind of tear through some content that way, which is kind of what I hope you're doing right now. So The Veil was a fantastic book. And it honestly blew me away. I had never expected to read something of the level and caliber that I was reading when Blake started telling his story. So we're going to get into a little bit of Blake's background and give you an introduction as to who he is and kind of where he comes from. But before that, let's talk a little bit about the prophetic, okay? Maybe you're listening to this show and you're all in on the prophetic, the charismatic gifts. Maybe you don't believe that those things operate in any way, shape, or form. Maybe you're just a spiritual person and you believe that not just the church, but other things out there also deal in the prophetic. I'm not really sure where everybody's coming from on this, but where I'm coming from on this is you probably started to kind of notice with comments that I make along the way. I am very much a charismatic. I don't go to like a Pentecostal church or anything, but I've been to them and I definitely believe that the gifts of the Spirit are active today. So that's just me. Again, full disclosure, when I say these kind of things, I like for you guys to know where I'm coming from, a little bit of what my filter and perspective on these things would be. So I've ran in these circles for years now. And, occasionally you see people that do have visions or they see something in the spirit. And so I think that we need to kind of quantify some of those things before we go into this for some people who maybe don't have that type of, background or framework in that type of sense in church settings. So often when you hear people describe things like visions, for instance, they describe it as something almost like that I would equate to a daydream, something that they kind of see. They're like in their regular world, kind of going through stuff every day. And this thing kind of pops up in their mind. Rarely does this moment take over their entire faculties, right? It's kind of like they're in the moment, but they're kind of seeing this thing. That's why I kind of compare it to a daydream. You kind of snap out of a daydream and you're like, whoa, but it was very vivid. You were seeing all these things. That's how a lot of people kind of encounter the prophetic or visions when they have them. There are the occasional, though, experiences where people talk about even going into heaven or hell, and having very dramatic, panoramic, very real experiences as well. There's kind of like the activity that exists on the normal basis inside charismatic churches where someone may see something when they're praying for someone, an image pops into their mind or something like that. Those things are pretty common. The open panoramic visions are a little less common, but Blake's experience is something that is really unique for me that I've come across. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I'm just saying that it's rare. And I can't really think of anyone else that has this type of experience with Blake. So what's really fascinating about Blake is that from his earliest childhood, he has seen into the spirit. And the way he describes this is basically as much as he would see you or I standing in front of them, he sees the things into the spirit. Now, he does have, usually for the most part, control over this faculty. He can see at will. into the spirit as he chooses to. And he compares this to like when you're riding in a car and you're driving down the road and you're looking through the windshield. Okay. You're seeing the road, you're focusing on the road, the cars and everything else is going around you, but you can shift your focus to the actual glass itself. It's not a perfect comparison, but that's kind of how he breaks down his ability to see into the spirit when he wants to, but that's something that he kind of had to learn and develop and grow. And as a child, you can only imagine he thinks that everything that he sees, everyone else sees, and that's just not quite the reality. So it was quite the shocker when he realized how different his experience of daily life was from everyone else. Why people didn't notice the giant flying black dog or the stoic men that were stationed outside his school every day, or people's houses, or the lady that would go up and down the hallway pouring oil on people and putting flowers on their head, everybody that she went by. Why there were teachers that would show up to school with cuts over their face that no one seemed to notice. There were all these things that he was seeing and no one else really saw. So you can imagine the adjustment as a child that you would have to go through, not really knowing what you were seeing, how to communicate it, and honestly, not even realizing that maybe other people didn't see the same things. Can you even imagine what that would experience would be like? His experience is so unique from just about everybody else's that I don't even know that I could even put myself in his shoes. But through the years and as he's gotten older, he's learned to really control these things. And he really kind of looks into the spirit when God prompts him to, or when God initiates it, but he still can very much choose to look into this world that goes unseen to so many of us anytime, every day, if he wants to. It's as if God has given him this gift that just allows him to do that. And it's, like I said, pretty unique to me and pretty fascinating. So his book, The Veil, is the first in kind of I wouldn't say it's necessarily a series, but it kind of is because it touches on a lot of the same things. And the sequential books kind of go into some more depth of some of the things and then additional information and additional experiences that you would hear in The Veil. And I highly recommend all of them. So let's get into a little bit of Blake's childhood kind of through his own telling. And what's really interesting about the audiobook is it's narrated by Blake himself. So it gives you a really good perspective on who he is as a person when you listen to the audiobook. So I do, for that reason, kind of recommend checking this out. So Blake was born in, I want to say California. His earliest memory, like I said earlier, about the age of 2, he remembers being in the minivan with his mother, and she's kind of stopped and she's talking to someone at a teller, probably like at a bank or something like that. And worship music is playing in the minivan, and he sees these baseball size light orbs, if you will, swaying and floating around his mother's head in sync and rhythm with the worship music as it's playing in the car. And he's just watching these things kind of dance around his mother's head. She doesn't know they're there. She's having a conversation with the lady at the teller, and he just kind of watches these things. So he's 2, very young. And that's kind of the extent of the memory. The next thing he can remember, not like in that same day, but kind of his next earliest memory would be what he describes as seeing a demon. His parents were in a little bit of an argument in the room above him in their house. And so he's just kind of standing in the room under them, looking up to the ceiling where the sounds are coming from. And as he describes it, this ghoulish face starts to basically seep out of the ceiling and the paint above him. Kind of imagine like a sheet being filled with water, right? And it's just kind of seeping down. And eventually, this whole demonic figure drops from the ceiling, or really it kind of floats down. It's very vague and misty from like the shoulders down, but very much your typical demonic type figure, on the head and shoulders, pointy teeth and, ears, and just, I can't remember if it was black or if it was more of like a pale green, but just kind of what you would imagine. Like I said, very, very stereotypical, and it freaks him out. He leaps into the bed. He pulls the covers over his head and he stays there just terrified. Eventually, he gets enough courage to pull the sheets back and it's gone. And that's kind of his second youngest memory. So, one very pleasant, what he describes as angels. I know that they're described as balls of light, but when he tells the story, he will very much say, my earliest memory is of seeing an angel. And he tells the story about the dancing balls of light. And he says, my Second memory is that of seeing a demon, and he tells a story about the demonic figure seeping out from the ceiling above him while his parents argued. As you can see, as far back as he can remember, this has been his experience every day, all around him. Like I said, riding in the car to school, walking around the school, these things were just everywhere. And what's really interesting when he's young, he describes it because I know I said he was afraid and he obviously jumped into the bed and covered his head and stuff like that. So I guess maybe there was moments of fear, but in general, he would see angels and demons anywhere and everywhere every day. And he saw a lot of great and beautiful things, but he saw a lot of the more darker things as well. These things were kind of side by side. If there's a crowd of people, you would see both, right? And so, but the way he describes the interaction is it's like you're at a zoo. And on the other side of the enclosure, whether it's glass or it's an open enclosure, are the animals and you're kind of looking down. Well, there's a lion down there, right? That's a dangerous animal, but you're not afraid, or the tiger or the gorilla or even a grizzly bear, whatever that might be, a shark at the aquarium, right? Like you're on the other side and you're safe. He said there was like this separation between these two worlds for him that made him feel safe and not particularly bothered by some of the things that he would see, even though they may be grotesque or demonic or, angelic and stuff like that. What I think is really interesting is, he talks about his experience as a kid going to church. Like I said, he didn't realize that no one would see the ladies. I love how he describes these things in his childlike thoughts at the time. Not to say that he still thinks about this, but he describes it in a very childlike way. He says, no one noticed the very beautiful ladies with clothes made of light and paint that were dancing across the tops of the chairs with 50-foot banners waving behind them during worship music. Could you imagine being in church and this is like what you see? Oh, and by the way, colorful balls of light are zipping back and forth across the room. Waves of oil and lightning and light and water are like washing over the people, and their lungs and their eyes and their mouths are filled with light as they come alive during worship. Like, what an experience. I mean, but what's so fantastic about this whole thing with Blake is it just gives you this perspective, right? That there these things that you sense, these things that you can kind of feel. They may be subtle, but there's something there oftentimes in the spiritual that is happening. And that sensitivity is something that you can build and learn from. Okay. And that's kind of why I want to touch on this because this book will very much play into another book that I want to go into later that also kind of deals with spiritual forces and stuff like that. But there's some very important things in this book that I want to touch on in this episode. I can't go through everything. It's not really the goal of this is to go through the whole book. It's to kind of pick out some of the key moments and elements of this book to hopefully encourage you to go check it out. But what Blake describes a lot of times seeing in the spirit is very, very interesting, right? It's often a representation. It is real, it is there, but you just kind of see through some of these stories that it's a representation of how do I say these things? It's a representation of the spiritual realities that are taking place. So for instance, there may be a altar call that's happening and he sees scaly black clawed demonic hands kind of holding on to the backs and the clothes of people, creating fear in them for going up and getting prayed for or something like that, right? So in the spirit, there is this thing that's there. Or like he talks about his, elementary school teachers having coming in with cuts and wounds, bleeding sometimes even like things growing in them, worms or maggots and stuff like that. And it's a representation of a spiritual reality or issue, wounds from their childhood, abusive relationships, you name it, right? The spiritual world reflects all these things very candidly. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of the kinds of things that he sees and will say kind of throughout this book. But let's kind of rewind a little bit. So, like I was saying, he was born in California, and his dad went to Bible school, and his mother kind of dreamed of becoming a missionary. So eventually, at the age of 5, his dad finishes Bible school, and the family moves to Russia. They're actually in Moscow, and he talks about the stark difference of the experience that he has between the church, back in California and the church in Moscow. And it's a very volatile time, the 80s in Moscow. And so there's a lot of political turmoil and things like this, and a lot of change is happening in that culture at this time. And so back home in California, the church experience that he had was very normal and I would say pretty typical for how your standard American church would have been back in the 80s. It was very different in Moscow. Here, they started to encounter really the spiritual gifts and activity more than they ever had before. And his parents weren't really trained in these things. So they're kind of learning on the fly in the mission field because what's happening is people are being delivered, people are crying out, they're laughing, they're crying, they're shouting, they're singing, they're dancing. All these things are happening because there's so much that's happening in the people in the services. And Blake describes seeing dark smoke coming out of people's mouths when they would get prayed for. Like I said, the demonic arms kind of holding some people back from the altar calls. You name it, like all sorts of the angelic activity is just kind of through the roof in these services. And it's all just spectacular and amazing and wonderful. He describes a lot of them having these scars around their wrists and ankles, kind of signifying the oppression that had recently fallen off of them as a culture. So you can only imagine, I mean, being a 5-year-old kid and just seeing some of these things, but he didn't have obviously the context that an adult would have had in that situation. But it was, like I said, very different from the church that he grew up in as a kid, and also for his parents. During this time, his parents pretty much obviously seeing what's happening day in and day out, become more charismatic. So eventually, I want to say about 3 years later, by the age of 8, they moved back to the States and they are now in Michigan. And they attend a church that's more in line with some of the things that they experienced in Moscow. And it's at this time that I mean, I can't really put my finger on the exact time that his parents started to kind of realize, oh, Blake's a little different because there was so much dismissal as he describes it, because they just think he has an overactive imagination or he's a young kid. He's like, hey, there's a dragon flying over that. Do you see that? And they're like, yeah, yeah, we see the dragon, so it's kind of like, but eventually, as his parents became more exposed to spiritual activity, their ears started to perk up at some of the things that he would say. And at this point in time, when he's 8 or 9, he starts talking more and more about it. His parents kind of take more interest in, I guess you could say, believing him. I don't, I think as a parent, like you don't ever completely dismiss anything your kids say, but they started taking some of these things a little bit more seriously than they had previously. And so being in a church that also now kind of accepted the gifts of the spirit, it wasn't quite as all out as it was in Moscow, but it was much more in tune with these things than their church back in California was. But there still really wasn't too much mentorship to happen here. But what does happen at this point of Blake's life is the zoo experience, the separation experience of seeing into the spiritual world on a daily basis shifts pretty dramatically for him. And so he tells this story. And before I get into it, I'm not sure if anybody's listening with kids or anything like that. So I think just in general, this episode, it kind of can go both ways. So just fair warning, some of the things that he's going to describe at this point of the story might be a little alarming to some of you. Or, if you have children around, I would probably recommend maybe giving you a little pause and preparing yourself for some of the things that are about to go down. So fair warning. But anyway, so I believe he's about 9 years old at this time, and they're living in Michigan. And he's gotten ready for bed, and he's laying down, and his parents are still kind of up. I mean, it's not like late at night, but kids' regular bedtime, I suppose. And his mom's back and forth in the hallway or whatever. He's not really paying too much attention to what's going on outside the room, but he notices someone stop outside his door. So he kind of rolls over thinking that it would be his mom to see what she was going to say or why she would have stopped in the doorway. But it wasn't his mom. Instead, this shadowy figure seeps into his room. It walks in through the doorway. Once again, very kind of smoky, shadowy, but he can definitely see it's a figure. It comes and it walks over and it stands at the foot of his bed and it just stops. Its eyes kind of flash white. Not really sure what that means, but that's how he describes it. Its eyes kind of flash white, and all of a sudden he feels the most fear he's ever felt in his life. The room gets very cold. Typical stories where if you've ever heard anything with shadow people or shadowy figures, sleep paralysis, these kind of, you'll start to notice kind of some of these same elements of the stories kind of threads through all of them like this. When this happens, he says it feels like straps come over his body and are basically like leather straps and are like holding him down to the bed. And he can't move. He doesn't know how long he was stuck that way. He said it could have been 10 seconds, it could have been 3 hours. He doesn't really know. But eventually he's able to break free from this. And, he just rolls over and goes to sleep, which is remarkable. But I guess when you see what you see on a daily basis, these things are a little bit desensitizing. The fear is new, but some of the visuals are not. He had seen, like he said, many dark or monstrous beings up until this point in time. So that part of it wasn't that much of a shocker, but the fear was definitely new. So he's able to go to sleep. He wakes up the next morning and it's gone. And everything kind of goes back to normal. The spiritual world is back to kind of being this zoo like experience. The separation is back up, the safety is there, and everything feels totally fine. So he thinks, okay, wow, back to normal. Not sure what that was about, but great. And so everything is fine all day long until that night. And this time, when his mother actually goes to tuck him in, he can't even focus on her because the shadowy figure is already standing at the foot of his bed, waiting behind his mother, basically for her just to leave. So as soon as she does, eyes flash white, the fear returns, and kind of night by night, this gets worse and worse. So this time he tries to kind of immediately just roll over and go to bed and focus on this. But the fear has a tangible presence. And he says, like, climbing up the back of his legs, up his back, holding him down. And, images start to play out in his mind, hellish images, torturing images, things that you would expect to see in the deepest, darkest places of hell, basically. And this goes on for a while till he's actually able to fall asleep. These experiences get worse and worse for him on a nightly basis. The third night, he basically just runs right into his room, puts his face in the pillow, and tries to go to sleep, and instantly the images are just in his head. He gets so mad and frustrated that he kind of goes to sit up and yell at this thing, but now the visions that were kind of in his mind are now in his room, and it's completely surrounding him. He describes some pretty terrible things that he sees at this point in time. I'm not really going to go into too much detail of them, but they're pretty graphic. Honestly, it's everything you could probably imagine. Just the worst things: tortures, demons tearing themselves apart in grotesque ways. It's awful. Eventually, he starts trying anything else. He starts playing worship music in his room at night, which helps a little bit. But eventually, after a couple of days, the radio stops working at night. Or if it does work, the music changes at night to eerie, like violin type music and just creepy, creepy stuff, or even just straight static. But in the daytime, the record player, or sorry, the tape player, is totally fine. It's just when night comes, it doesn't work. His parents started praying with him before bedtime to try to help. They gave him verses to say, to speak, and none of it worked at all. They would even let his younger sister, who they adopted when they were in Russia, sleep with him in his room. I think on like a little couch in there. And literally the demonic activity would take place for him, and he would see angels protecting his younger sister. So just really, really intense stuff. And this goes on every night for 3 years. He endures this. And I can't even imagine. I mean, to hear Blake describe some of these things and to realize that he goes through this every single night of his life as a 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old kid is just, man, it does something to you, especially as a parent, because you're doing everything you know to do. But if you're someone that doesn't experience this world the way that he does, how do you even go about trying to help someone, right? So eventually they move from Michigan back to Southern California. And now they go to a very charismatic church where they actually teach and try to develop people in the spiritual gifts. And it's very much active. And so his mother at this point is very involved in charismatic circles as well. And she ends up going to a prophetic group, and she brings Blake along with her. Because at this point, they've recognized that Blake obviously has a spiritual gift, and it's something that needs to be developed. During this time, Blake starts to realize that's exactly what it was, that he has this spiritual gift that he didn't really know what to do with and how to develop and how to mentor, because where are the mentors for these kind of things? But in this circle, at least there were people that, operated in the charismatic gifts and had some experience. And more importantly, they knew who God was. They knew what the Bible said about them. And these are the kind of things that they started to implant in Blake. And this is what started to change him. He says something here that's really important that I think for anyone that may be out there listening to this, and you're like, I have these same issues. What in the world do I do? I'm kind of in the same boat as his parents. I don't know exactly how to help, but I can tell you what helped Blake. And I think that it can help all of us in a way. Blake says something that I think is really important. Like I said, he says, seeing in the spirit is all but worthless if you don't know what God has to say. And that's huge, right? Because he talks about seeing all these things. He says he was saved at the age of 3, but he didn't really have a personal relationship with God. He didn't really know God as a person. So he's seeing all these things. He's experienced all these things. He's seeing angels. He's seeing demons. His life is full of these things, but God, the person, is absent from this. So when he's at this church at the age of, 12, 13 years old, he starts to learn about who God is, his identity in Christ. He starts getting this idea of what God thinks about him. And he says, it's at this point when I started to realize these things, that who God was, what he was like, what he has to say, and what he has to say about me, what he thinks about me. He said within a week, the experiences all but stopped. And he said after even the first couple of nights of kind of coming to this realization, he's like, yeah, they were still kind of happening, but at this point, they were about as scary as like a puppet show. They were there, but his identity and his understanding of who God was completely disarmed this entity's ability to torture him. That is so strong, right? Because he was like listening to worship music and he was reciting things in the name of Jesus and all these prayers that his parents had given him. Ritual. He says he was doing ritual, right? And he says, knowing what God says about you is more important than any ritual. And I would agree with that, because I don't have a problem with tradition necessarily. I don't have a problem with, things like communion. These are rituals and traditions that belong in the church. But combating things like this in a spiritual way, the rituals, that's what witches do, right? That's what New Agers do. The mystery schools do. They conduct a ritual in order to get a result, right? That's not how we operate in Christ. How we operate in Christ is different. Operating in Christ is all about identity and understanding who God is and who you are in Christ. It's totally different, right? Because you're part of the family. You have these rights you are given. You are a co-heir. Okay. We do it completely different. And when he learned this, like I said, it completely disarmed this entity's ability to torture him. Its power was completely broken when he got not just the word in him, but the belief in it. When he started believing God, these things began to change. So if you're out there, and I feel like there's someone that may listen to this at some point, and maybe you've just been in tears this whole time listening to this episode and you're just relating to what happened to Blake, just be encouraged by this story. Okay, you need to be in a church that believes in the spiritual gifts, that is a healthy place, and to be mentored. But if you can't find a body of believers, get into the word. I highly recommend this book. Okay, this is going to help you kind of see things in a way that maybe you haven't before, and you're going to gain perspective for someone whose perspective is quite unique. But I kind of want to go back into Blake's story a little bit, because even though these things kind of change, he really does struggle because he's a young kid. I mean, he's being thrust into prophetic circles. And when he tells about things that he sees, whether it's angels or demons or, he sees things on people too. Like people are represented in the spirit to him in certain ways. He may see flowers growing off of someone, or, an article of clothing, a robe or something like made of colors and light, like I said earlier. People just have questions, right? Because they've never seen anything like this. They're just curious what these things mean. And as a kid, he doesn't know what to say, the other thing that I think is it's funny to me. It's not probably funny to him, but this awkward adolescent teenage kid trying to learn to minister and pray for people. He's placed on like the prayer team at 13 because he can see demons on people, right? And so, it's he's like awkward. He doesn't know what to do. He goes up to people and he's like, sir, you have a demon and its chain is around your neck. And I think it is this sin that's in your life. And, the guy just leaves. He just goes straight. He's right. Like he's totally reading this guy's mill because he's seeing it. It's totally accurate. That's why this guy leaves, And so he gets mad and just bolts. So he's like, I don't know what to do. So he spends a lot of those years he kind of goes into his shell, which is completely understandable, because he doesn't know how to use the gift. And he spends much of the years after this kind of shutting down eventually. He comes back around and because, God's called him to this and he realized that it's a gift that he needs to share with people and he needs to share with the world. Another thing that he kind of goes through, especially at this church that he's at this point in his life, is he starts to see kind of how people minister to other people. And this is something that I think is very important again, and something that I really want to kind of touch base on. So in the prophetic group that they're in at the time, again, keep in mind, he's like 12, 13 years old. There was a lady and she, in his words, had a very powerful prophetic gift and she moved in this gifting a lot of times. And there was another gentleman who would come every week and, he was struggling. Yeah, he's one of these guys that he always had a problem. He always had a prayer request. Life was a struggle. How you doing, man? Oh man, I'm hanging in there, kind of one of these guys. And he was there every week. And Blake can kind of see some of the demons active in his life and certain types of demons that he sees kind of cues him on to the types of sins where there's sexual sins, you know, things like that. He can kind of hone in on those things, because each demon kind of represents a sin in that kind of way. So she starts prophesying over this guy one time, and he notices on her, there's like this faint scar, and this scar runs from her ear to like her mouth, kind of like along her jawline. And he's like, it was a really faint thing. And I had seen it before, and I never really thought anything about it because it's kind of like this discolored skin, like faint discoloration of skin where like maybe there was a scar at one point, and the scar has healed. It kind of looks like that. But when she starts prophesying over this guy, in this particular instance, he says that scar completely rips open. Her jaw is just hanging down from one side and the flesh is all stringy and rotten and there's maggots all in there and all this stuff. And the guy obviously has a demon that's kind of there with him. And so what caused this was the demon that was kind of around this guy with chains and stuff like that, because he had some bondage issues that he was dealing with. The demon kind of floated up and was between the woman and the man. And so he can see that she's kind of looking at this man through the demon, right? Like in a transparent kind of way. And when that happened, she started prophesying in a way. She started kind of keying in on the things that he was struggling in his life. Okay. And so Blake was very thrown off, but he's like, I see a lot of things, but sometimes I'm not expecting them and they surprise me. And this is one of those situations where when this woman's jaw kind of rips open, he's very surprised. And the demon kind of floats through the air and puts itself between Blake and the guy. And now Blake is seeing through the demon into the guy. And he starts experiencing feelings of contempt for this man. Like, how could you do this? And what he's doing is he's seeing the man through the sin of the man. And he's like, and I could see and feel all of the things basically that this woman was feeling too, right? So there was this moment where she's prophesying and she is keying in on these things. And what's happening is she starts seeing the man who goes to their church, right, in a different way. And so what Blake learned later on is that she was in a very abusive relationship earlier in her life. And there were a lot of really bad things that happened to her in that time. And so that man's sin really poked at that wound inside of her. And so when she saw those things, she started prophesying really some not so great things to him, like, you're going to ruin your life if you don't repent and or maybe not repent is what the word she used, but if you don't change your ways or something like that, and the guy was just deflating before them. I don't say that to judge any of the people in this story whatsoever. The reason I bring up this particular story is it illustrates something that I think we all need to be very careful of, especially those of us that run in charismatic circles. Is that just because you may have a gift, a prophetic gift or something like that, or just because you have sensed the Spirit of God does not make you immune to other spiritual forces. Okay. It's really important that we all remain humble, test the spirits to see if they're from God. This is extremely important because if we allow ourselves to enter into a situation like this where we're letting a different spirit inform how we see someone that isn't the way that God sees someone, we are in error and we need to check ourselves. Okay. Because that's very damaging. And that's what was happening to this guy. More shame was coming in. He wasn't finding freedom, he was finding condemnation and shame. And that wasn't good for him or anyone else involved. So, just something to be mindful of because he tells stories of kind of these sorts of things happening where the demons that are present are altering people's perception of who they are, the reality around them, whether it's an immense feeling of fear or condemnation or shame or hopelessness. And I think there's some of us out there that can relate to that. That sometimes when you're feeling certain things, especially when you're battling with something like depression, anxiety, all these types of feelings, there's a force that will find that. Okay. And I don't say that to discourage you. I say that to say the more you recognize it and the more sensitive you are to God's spirit and to God's voice, you start to realize the subtle differences of the other voices. Okay. And it takes maturity to begin to set aside the perspectives that are not healthy. Okay. That's why Paul says you got to take every thought captive. Okay. Because just that alone says that whether they're your own thoughts or, maybe a more intrusive thought from an external source, it needs to be brought captive because in so many stories that Blake tells, these thoughts are entering in through these other entities. Okay. And they masquerade their influence as our own thoughts sometimes. And that's not to say that your own thoughts aren't your own, but sometimes your thoughts may be influenced by something else. And it's very helpful when you identify something like that to know that that's not something you have to listen to. It's a lie. It's a lie, okay? And so much of our struggle is believing the truth and not the lies. Okay? So it's a process for all of us to unpack these things and to kind of go through some of these things together. But guys, you can do it. So I kind of want to close out with two of the visions that Blake has that I think are really significant in this book. The first one being when he's with the youth group, I guess he's probably a little bit further into his teenage years. So I'm not really sure, somewhere between probably 13, 15. The youth group is going out on the weekend, really just to spend time together. So if you ever grew up in a youth group, it's very common to like, hey, let's go play ball or go bowling or see a movie. There's always some kind of youth group outing. Well, in this particular outing, they were going shopping. And after they went shopping, they were kind of going to go to the beach. So Venice Beach, which is right there in LA. If you've never been to Venice Beach, I've been to Venice Beach. It's a very interesting place. It's known for like muscle heads and like workout people, but it's an eclectic bunch out there on Venice Beach. If you've ever been, you definitely know all about that. So the youth group does kind of their shopping and then they are just going to kind of go for a walk on the beach. I don't know if this is like a particular day, or if this is a regular occurrence, but there's like booths set up everywhere, kind of craft booths and other things like that. But when he describes this scene, it's pretty amazing. I'm going to paraphrase some of it because I could never tell it as well as he does. Just go listen to it in the book, but you'll get the idea. So they get to the beach and he describes the setting. There's dark clouds swirling overhead with light kind of like twisted in them. So it's like there's light and there's darkness just kind of swirling above them, but not mixing. Right. So the strands of dark clouds and the strands of light are just kind of twisting and intermingling, kind of like when you take paint and you kind of mix it all up before the colors blend. You can just see how the street kind of something like that with the shadowy darkness and the light in the sky. There are angels and demons flying around everywhere. He describes the demons as having kind of these stained glass window wings. And iron rod legs, whatever that means, and the angels are full of light and color and they're just all it's just everything is happening all at once all around them. And so they start walking into the beach and this first lady they come across, she has a booth set up. Well, I should say the first lady he mentions, maybe not the first one they come across. He says there's hundreds of people that he sees things like this with, but this is one of the stories that he hones in on. So there's a lady, and for lack of a better term, she's a fortune teller, a psychic. But he sees that she has these golden glasses on in the spirit. Okay. He's like, these glasses are very beautiful. They're very ornate, but they're all dinged up and scratched and banged and bent. And what he kind of understands in that moment is her gift of sight, her abilities, if you will, are something that was given to her by God. That may be a controversial statement to some of you, and it is what it is. I'm just kind of relaying the book to you. But she's using this God given gift in not the best ways because she doesn't understand it. And he kind of senses that about her that, she doesn't know what to do with this gift. And obviously he can relate to that, right? And luckily for him, he had good parents and a good home to kind of get him into church and to help develop these things. Well, not everybody has those things. And so this is a woman with a God given gift that didn't know what it was or how to use it. So she ends up in, the new age or whatever that might be, but she has a legitimate gift of a seer, if you will. He doesn't really stop and talk to her, so I don't really know. There's not much of a description with how she's using the gift, but in a typical psychic booth out of, a fair kind of way. So they keep walking. Another person they come across is this man. He has a shaved head. I think he has like a beard, and he has this table out in front of him with these bracelets all over it, kind of like woven handmade bracelets. On his head, however, is a black, oily, four tentacled octopus like creature that's like sitting on top of his head with its tentacles kind of wrapped around his head. If I kind of understand how he's telling it, a couple of the girls stop to look at the bracelets, and he says one of the girls like picks them up and kind of almost like feels the dirtiness of it, like spiritually. She's kind of like reacts to it like, "Oh, wow. Like that's gross." Kind of is her expression, and she places it back down. But obviously the man kind of strikes up conversation with them. He ends up handing her like a little cutout piece of paper, inviting her to like some new age spiritualist thing and yada yada. She's like, "Yeah, okay, cool, thanks. That's great." And they just kind of keep walking. There are stories like this throughout the whole beach area. And he's kind of like, God, like, what do we do? There's so much here. There's so many people. And he's overwhelmed, and oftentimes this does happen to him, because like, where do you begin? He's like, there's hundreds of people. He's like, they all have these similar situations. And, he's like, what do we do? God's like, turn around, look back. As he turns and he looks back across the beach the whole area where they had just walked through, light had cut through the clouds in the pathway that they had walked. Now he's like, now we didn't really pray for anybody. That wasn't really the point of this particular outing. They were just kind of going out to hang out and spend time together and enjoy, just fun youth group activities. But they did pray before they left, and they were like, God, if you would just go with us, if there's anything we can do, just kind of a typical prayer. Like if there's people that you would have us pray for, just lead us and show us. So they did pray this, okay. And so the light has cut through the clouds in the path that they had walked precisely. And he looked and he saw the lady with the golden glasses. Her glasses were fixed, shiny, new, renewed, if you will, sparkling gold and beautiful and shiny. The lenses were clean, all these kind of things. And look, jump to your own conclusions. Think about that what you will. He's just telling us what he sees, and I'm telling you what he said he saw. So the guy, this is what I think is really interesting. When the light touched the oily black thing, tentacle, little demon that's on this guy's head, it leaves the man's head and it climbs up under his table and is hiding from the light. And he can kind of see this like sense of peace on this guy's face. And the angels kind of like bask in the light, whenever they pass through it. And the demons all just shun and run from the light as they see it. And I find this scene as it's playing out to be fascinating on many levels. First off, the lady. Okay. And I know I keep kind of circling back around her because this is a hard one to swallow, I think, for a lot of people, because most people, I think, kind of they operate under this impression that these gifts are given when people get saved. You know, what I take from this story is that no, this lady always had this gift, kind of like Blake had this gift from his earliest of years. Okay. She had a similar gift. You know, who knows? Maybe she saw the world like he did. I mean, we really don't know what all these glasses actually signify, but obviously we know how she was using those talents later on. And so, but it's the light, I think, touching the gift again and renewing it that I find to be really interesting because you would think that like the light would like break the glasses or like something else would happen, but the light renewed the gift because it was a God given gift. I think that's absolutely fascinating. Or the guy that's obviously the new age dude that's trying to kind of invite these young high school, middle school, whatever they may have been, youth group kids to a new age spiritualist gathering or whatever it might have been. But when the light touches him, he finds what looks like a moment of peace or freedom. And the demon's influences kind of broke off of him for a little bit. We don't know these things, right? Like average people don't see and notice that in their everyday life. But I find this very encouraging, right? Because you think nothing is happening, right? Because to most of us, it's just like if we were just strolling along down the beach, we're oblivious, right? But even the smallest prayer was effective for these kids. And he's like, maybe we should have stayed. He's like, part of me thinks that had we started praying for people, we never would have left. We'd be there to this day because there was just so much to do. And I think it's really easy in this moment to just say, well, why didn't you pray for people? This is so obvious. I mean, guys, he's 13. Like, how good was your spiritual discernment and, sensitivity to God when you were 13? I know mine wasn't great. So I can kind of understand. And he's a very normal kid. I remember my youth group days, it's like, whatever, you're talking to the girls, you're doing whatever, but it's just Blake can see the spiritual world for what it is. So a really, really interesting story. Another story that he kind of goes into, which I think is absolutely fascinating. And this one's actually kind of early in the book, but it illustrates, I think, the greater point here that I'm also trying to make. He's in a coffee shop. So this is modern day. Actually, let's bring us up to speed. So from California, Blake goes through high school. He goes through all these things and he goes through a lot of changes and accepting kind of who he is, and people prophesy over his life and kind of call him out on some things, kind of hide that he's hiding, that he's got this thing that he needs to use and needs to share. And he goes through these amazing experiences on mission trips and things like that. And he eventually opens up to his gift and really his call to ministry. And so he ends up at Bethel and Redding. And I know people probably have their thoughts about that, but I really don't care. He ends up at Bethel. And it's here that he really, I think, enters into the ministry as it is now, this phase of ministry that he's in to this day, because he meets the couple that actually would end up moving to Atlanta and starting Bethel Atlanta. And he is now on staff. He runs the Supernatural School of Ministry at Bethel Atlanta. So for me, this hits really close to home because I live just outside of Atlanta in good old Athens, Georgia. So, this is right in my backyard. And he's had some pretty amazing encounters regarding prophetic things about Atlanta that I'd like to get into on another episode, but that's kind of specific to maybe me and people around my area. So I haven't gone into it in this episode because it might be a little too specific. But so Blake's doing great. His family is wonderful. I think they have 4 kids now, very healthy. He's come a long way. But even he talks about as, writing this book for the first time, just and what that experience was like. And it was hard. It was hard to put all these things into word, but he's doing well. So if you're ever in the Atlanta area, south of Atlanta, Bethel, Atlanta is down by the Chick-fil-A headquarters in Georgia. And complete tangent side note, if you know about the Hawaiian Chick-fil-A down there, then you know. I'm talking mahi fish tacos, pineapple chicken tacos, blackened mahi sandwiches. Listen, it's a treat. It's viral. Like if you go there, it's almost impossible to get in. So he's not too far from Fayetteville, Peachtree City down there on the south side. That's where Bethel, Atlanta is. Definitely go check it out. So I want to close on kind of a short story. It's not as dramatic as some of the other ones, but again, it kind of drives the point home that I think this episode is kind of taking hold of. He's in a coffee shop and he often describes being like, he sees, I mean, he can see people's thoughts and conversations. are like floating around their head. Angels, demons, I mean, you name it. There's just the activity is crazy should he choose to look at it. So, kind of, he notices this little impish demon kind of circling this girl. Kind of like sitting at a table. I think she's on her laptop, and it kind of sheepishly walks up and touches her leg, and she doesn't really notice. So it kind of scampers up her leg and kind of climbs up onto her back, like up on her shoulders. And it runs its little hands through her hair. And he notices, well, she notices, like she kind of feels something, right? So she goes and she kind of runs her fingers through her hair. And now she's reacted to it. So the demon's kind of like, huh. And then Blake kind of sees that there was this black oily substance that was on the demon that kind of transferred to her hair and subsequently transferred to her hand, but she doesn't notice that. But almost instantaneously, he sees her demeanor change. He's like, I don't know what it was. Maybe it was something stressful about school. Maybe a friend said something bad about her. He's like, but I see her countenance change, and I can see that she like grabs, kind of like rubs her like brow, like squeezes like her nose, you know what I'm saying? Like out of stress and frustration. He's like, but the demon thinks he's kind of like getting somewhere. He's like, but as quickly as that thought and that mood kind of came, I see her shake it off. And she kind of sits up in her chair, and you can tell she just kind of shakes that thought away. And when she does, this like causes the demon to like fly off backwards and stumble onto the ground and kind of lose its kind of hold on the moment, and it scurries off. But the oily substance remains. And what Blake says in that moment, he's like, she has to continue to choose to believe the thing and the thoughts and the right thing that caused the demon to fall off of her in the first place. Okay. She has to keep that thought. And if she does, eventually that oily substance, that feeling, that gloom will leave, but it takes time. Okay. So understanding that there are spiritual things that are influencing our world, it's not just that moment of revelation that kind of breaks things wide open, though it can happen that way sometimes. Okay. It's the continual daily application of the renewed mind that is so vital to succeeding in this as people and individuals. And being around people that believe in you and encourage you will do wonders as well. But knowing what God thinks about you and what God says about you is the strongest tool for all of this. So I know it's kind of focused maybe more on the darker demonic side of things, but I want you to know there's a lot of amazing stories in there of angelic encounters, some of the most glorious stories and experiences that I've ever heard. Angels chopping the heads off of demons and just obliterating them. Having a vision of a man with a fiery sword and a woman in like a robe with like a white staff, just decimating hordes of demons to the soundtrack of Rage Against the Machine, which if you're of my age, you're like, nice. But I know that kind of maybe breaks some of y'all's brains a little bit, but I particularly enjoyed that part of the book. Different visions of the Holy Spirit. Sometimes it's like a giant lion, kind of Narnia style, just basking in the glow of worships, just the presence of God and the overwhelming might of heaven against these dark forces, the principalities, that dragon like entities that just fall out of the sky and they look all big and ferocious, but then they shrivel into nothing before him and angels that he's with. And he's like, what is this? And, God's like, it's a principality of poverty or whatever it might be. He's like, rebuke it, take authority, and he does, and he moves on, and there's some glorious, just wonderful stories. He talks about, it may not be in this book, it could be one of the other ones, but he talks about one of the guardian angels that's always in his house and how he's just so old and stoic and his armor is just seasoned. Everything about him is just seasoned. He's like, it's not that he's old. It's not about age. It's like, but his form represents who he is and what he's been through. So he appears older, but he has experience and wisdom. And that's kind of how things in the spirit work, right? The form that they take represents something, so it's a little bit unique and it's dynamic in that way. but it's absolutely glorious. And I highly recommend going and checking out the book. Well, that's going to do it for today's episode, everybody. Thank you so much for hanging in there and joining me on this one. I know it was a little bit of a different format from what we've kind of done in the past. So you're kind of seeing the diversity come into some of the episodes a little bit more. I've been eager to kind of get to these type of episodes. I've got a few other books kind of backlogged that I want to jump into with you guys. But hey, do you have any books? Are there some that you've enjoyed greatly and would, recommend and send my way? I'm more than happy to check some of those out. You can find me on Twitter, Faith and Fringe. You can find me on Instagram, FAF Podcast. You can always just go straight to the website, www.faithandfringe.com. There's a contact button there. You can email me some links or anything like that. I would love to check out, some of the things that you guys have out there. So send them my way. All right, everybody. I hope you have a good one. I love you all. Thank you so much for joining me on this one. I'll see you next time. Peace.